Hello, everybody. Today I'll be going over slavery and Reconstruction, basically the major events related to these two topics. And here's a quick look at the timeline that I made. Basically, all the major events are concentrated in before and after Reconstruction era. So let's get started. So first, to start off, we have to talk about how the African Americans ended up in the United States. It's really simple. It's through the transatlantic slave trade, and the reason for that is American colonies needed labor. They needed cheap labor. So yeah. So now let's jump into the American Revolution. So after America was established, an independent nation, after they gained independence from Britain, the founding father drafted the Constitution. You might ask, why is the Constitution rather important to slaves? That's because within the Constitution, there's an amendment that is the three-fifth compromise. It's basically saying that when calculating the population of the state, a slave will be counted as 3/5 of a person. So this will be really important decades later when the United States is trying to balance the power between northern and southern states in the House of Representatives and also in the House of Senates. So now we go to the Northwest Ordinance. This is basically, if you look at the image right here, is this territory. The act basically outlaws slavery in the Northwest Territory, and this is important because it paved ways for later acts to try to ban slavery when America expanded to a new territory. Okay, so now we have the Manumission Acts passed in the 1780s. So these acts basically allow slave owners to free their slaves, and some acts even prohibited the abuse of slaves and allowed slaves to be freed without the masters paying a large fee. And this is important because it kind of created a population of free African Americans up in the North, and this will later help with the abolition movements. And these actions are often forbidden in the South, and some of the acts that were legal in the North in the 1780s were later overturned and made illegal. So now let's talk about the end of the slave trade. So United States banned slave trade in 1808. So basically, after the Civil War, the northern economy is not dependent on slave labor anymore. They're rather like a manufacturing kind of region. However, the South demanded slaves labor because their economy is based on plantation. However, after the discussion between the North and the South, they figured out the number of slaves in the South is enough. As you can see, there are over 4 million slaves in the South. So they joined forces together and abolished the slave trade. And now let's talk about the Second Awakening. So the Second Awakening is really important because it advocated this idea that salvation can be achieved through free will, rather than before, like the Puritans, they believed in predestination. So this idea is really important to African Americans because it basically implies that everyone could be saved and go to heaven, including the slaves. So that's kind of the theme of equality for all human beings, regardless of their races. So this is also important because it contributed to the growing abolition movements. And in the image, you can see there's a Black preacher speaking to American citizens. So now let's talk about the Missouri Compromise. This starts a series of compromises that basically the U.S. government tried to balance the number of slave states and free states to kind of avoid conflicts that are sparked by the tension of slavery. So as America expanded westward, they discovered territories such as the like Missouri, as you can see, the gray area above, and like the red area was just Missouri. And so basically this compromise states that Missouri is a slave state and made Maine a free state while banning slavery from the remaining Louisiana Purchase lands located north of the 3630 parallel. And this is really important because this will be later turned by other acts that were trying to balance this, the number of slave states and free states, which all build up to the Civil War. As you can see, one of the examples that like overturned this act is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So as the North and the South argued over the issue of slavery, whether slavery should be illegal or legal, slaves themselves also tried. Slaves in the South themselves also tried to rebel, as you can see here. One of the most famous rebellion is the Matt Turner Rebellion. So basically, what happened was that Turner was an enslaved man, and he led a rebellion of enslaved people on August 2nd, 1831, and the rebels killed between 55 and 65 people, and they were mostly white. However, this rebellion was not by any means successful because after this rebellion, a new wave of oppressive legislation happened, like prohibiting the education movement and assembly of enslaved people. So oppression towards slaves were deepened after this rebellion, so it wasn't successful. So now let's talk about the abolition movement a little bit more. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass was, this is a book, an autobiography by Frederick Douglass, was published in 1845. So Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave who became a prominent activist, author, and public speaker. So Frederick Douglass is arguably like the most famous abolitionist during that time period, and he is extremely intelligent, and it's basically like a lot of people will argue that African Americans are inferior to white, but he's an example that kind of just offset all those arguments, since he's so he's intelligent and he is capable of what many educated white men can do. So even after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, which freed the slaves, he continued to push for equality and human rights until his death. So yeah, and this is really important because it further contributed to the growing abolitionism. So now let's talk about the Underground Railroad, which was also a form of abolitionism. So the Underground Railroad was a network of people, African Americans as well as whites, offering shelter and aid to escaped slaves from the South. So the Quakers, who believed in gender equality as long as just equality among human beings, are considered to be the first organized group to actively help escape slaves. And a name that most people heard of is Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave coming back to help slaves escape, and her story is pretty fascinating. So now let's talk about another compromise that tried to deal with the balance of the number of free and slave states is the Compromise of 1850. So the compromise admitted California as a free state, left Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves whether to be slave or a free state. This is the idea of popular sovereignty, and it defined a new Texas-New Mexico boundary and made it easier for slave owners to recover runaway slaves under the new fugitive slave Act of 1850. So what's really important here, especially to African Americans, is actually the new Fugitive Slave Act. So what the act does is that it's basically a federal law that allowed for capture and return of the runaway enslaved people within any territory of the United States. So and citizens have to help. So let's say, for example, a slave ran from the south to the north, and slave owners went to the north to recapture their slaves. Northerners have to help them, by under law, under the influence of law. Northerners have to help Southerners to recover the runaway slaves. So this angered a lot of Northerners, as before this act, they often had the mindset of, well, slavery is evil, but we're not actively participating in it, so I guess it's okay. But now they're actually actively, they have to help Southerners to recapture their slaves. So this angered a lot of Northerners, but it's terrible for the slaves, as their chances of running away again decrease. So now let's move to the I guess another compromise, which is kind of the final compromise before the Civil War, which is the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So this act basically made popular sovereignty illegal, allowing settlers of territories to decide whether slavery would be allowed. And this is important, as I mentioned above, because it overturned the Missouri Compromise. So basically, as you can see, the gray area, if you remember, the picture on the other side, the gray area, like the Nebraska territory, Kansas territory, if by the definition of the Missouri Compromise, it should be a free state, like a territory where slavery is prohibited. But under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it can be a slave state. It really depends on who goes there and whether people want slaves or not. So this led to conflicts that arose between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. And it led to a period of violence known as the Bleeding of Kansas. It's armed conflicts between them, two forces, and many historians even consider this to be the start of the Civil War. So now let's talk about the Dred Scott decision in 1855. So this is a Supreme Court case that basically the court claims that all African Americans are property and they are not entitled to enjoy the same rights as white Americans. And this enraged abolitionist, who saw the Supreme Court ruling as a way to stop the debate about slavery in territories. And many of the Northerners are upset as well, due to the fact that they want these newly claimed territories to be free states. And this again further contributed to tension over slavery and eventually sparked the Civil War. And just right before the Civil War, there's an incident. John Brown attacks Harper's Ferry. Is basically an abolitionist. John Brown leads a small group of a small group on a raid against federal this place in Virginia, an attempt to start an armed revolt of enslaved people and destroy the institution of slavery. So this it's like the Nat Turner Rebellion I mentioned previously. It scared a lot of the Southerners, and Southerners were kind of frightened. So it again leads to the Civil War. So now finally the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. African Americans played a large role in the Civil War. A lot of slaves from the South ran towards the North, and when they successfully escaped, they joined the Union Army. And as you can see here, by the end of the Civil War, 10% of the Union Army are African Americans. So, what's most important is during the Civil War, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which states that all enslaved people in the states currently engaged in rebellion against the Union shall be then forever free. So it abolished slavery, basically. Now, after the Civil War, it basically starts this era of Reconstruction, and the assassination of President Lincoln is what many people consider a major event because it's a president getting assassinated. But however, it's far more important than that because it directly impacted the era of Reconstruction due to the fact that there are two plans proposed to deal with Reconstruction. There's the plan proposed by Lincoln's 10% plan, which basically it's easy. This plan made it easy for southern states to return to the Union. So, for example, a couple of examples: 10% of the state's voter had to swear an oath to the Union. It doesn't matter if they previously supported the Confederacy or not. And two is just write a new state constitution that abolished slavery, and full pardon for all but the highest ranking Confederate officials. So there's really no punishment for the South other than the fact that they have to obey, the Emancipation Proclamation to abolish slavery. However, the other plan that some people opposed is what people call the Radical Reconstruction Plan is kind of the opposite of Lincoln's, and which makes Lincoln's assassination so important, and had a large impact on the Reconstruction era because after Lincoln was assassinated, it's just obvious that people are going to follow the Radical Reconstructionist plan. So basically, these people passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts and outlined how governments based on universal male suffrage were to be organized, and it required the Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, granting equal protection. And in 1869, Congress approved another amendment, the 15th Amendment, and guaranteed citizens the right to vote. So the Radical Reconstructionists are giving a lot of rights to African Americans and really pushed for this idea of racial equality. And at first, it was relatively successful. Actually, it was pretty successful because you have African Americans in government, as you can see in the image right here. Some congressmen, senators are colored. They're not white. They're African Americans. So it was pretty successful. However, then you have resistance forces such as the KKK, founded in 1865. And KKK basically functioned as a Southern resistance to the policies that the previous slide covered, like how they granted African Americans equal protection, they granted African Americans enfranchisement, and how African Americans are participating in government. And so basically, this is the KKK is basically a terrorist group in which they strive for the re-establishment of white supremacy. And this was really successful as through the democratic victories in state legislatures across the South in the 1870s. So they used violence to threaten people and unfortunately, it worked. So as you can see in here, at least 10% of Black legislators elected during this time period became victims of violence. So yeah, that's pretty sad. And okay, so Fisk University was founded in 1866. So why would you might wonder why is like the university being founded so important? That's because this university is kind of designed for African Americans. So it was inspired by the Freedmen Bureau, which is an organization that provided education for African Americans during the Reconstruction era. And in 1930, Fisk was the first African American institution to gain recognition by a Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. So it's kind of a trailblazer in some sense, because back then most of the universities rejected African American students. So this university is designed to especially to include African Americans. So now let's talk about the end of the Reconstruction era. So what ended the Reconstruction era the Reconstruction era was ended by many factors, but the bargain of 1877 was like a major one. It's basically an informal agreement between the Southern Democrats and allies of the Republican presidential candidate B. Hayes, which is that the Democrats agreed to not block Hayes' victory on the condition that Republicans withdraw all federal troops from the South. So, and this is important because without troops, these acts that were passed during the Reconstruction era, like how African Americans have the right to vote, African Americans have to have a right to equal protection, they cannot be enforced. Thus, you have Jim Crow laws, which pushed for racial segregation, literacy tax, grandfather clause, poll tax, etc., that denied African Americans these rights they were granted during Reconstruction. So that really marked the end of the Reconstruction and proved that Reconstruction ultimately, even though it was successful at the start, failed. So when talking about Jim Crow laws, of course you have to talk about the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, which took place in 1896. This court case was a decision that upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. It basically upheld Jim Crow laws. It basically said that Jim Crow laws are okay. So the context is obviously, as we talked about, the bargain of 1877 is that the disenfranchisement and other disadvantage as white supremacy reasserted itself across the South. And so yeah, Supreme Court really upheld the decision of separate and equal. And this was later turned by Brown versus the Board of Education decades later. So yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. This is the Works Cited page.